everybody, and welcome back to Psychedelics Today. This is Joe Moore coming at you from Breckenridge, Colorado. Today on the show, we have Jason Grechanik, the host of the Universe Within podcast, also a long-standing person involved in ayahuasca. Really interesting character. Had a great time recording with Jason today. I think both of us weren't really too familiar with each other's work, and it was just a really great chance happening. Turns out a number of mutual friends have been trying to get us to speak for years. So it's really lovely to get a chance to connect and dig in. We go all over the map, talk a lot about how kind of the ayahuasca plant medicine traditions do have some really interesting overlaps with the Western world, all sorts of comparative stories between, West and traditional practices. For whatever reason, I was falling back to the hippie thing, East meets West. Not what we talked about here, ancient meets modern. And really, really great time. This is the longer one. I think it's almost an hour and 40 minutes, maybe a little bit more than that. So hold on, everybody. And yeah, Jason's done work at Temple of the Way of Light and all sorts of really great places. So really appreciate Jason. Thank you, mutual friends who tried to get us to connect years ago. And yeah, hope to reconnect with Jason more in the future. Really, really fun stuff here. So enjoy this one. This is a little more woo, maybe. Well, we talk a lot more about philosophy, religion, and energy and spirit, things like that. It's not as much clinical conversation as we usually have. So hope that's okay. Hopefully it breaks up the monotony of the clinical. So enjoy it. And thanks everybody for tuning in. Joe Moore, see you on the other side. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. Joe Moore here, joined by Jason, Grechanik.
Yeah.
How you doing today, Jason?
Good. Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, excited. So we have a number of mutual friends, and you've been up to some quite interesting work for a number of years now. Currently, you're living in the Sacred Valley, but I guess let's talk about who you are and how you got interested in ayahuasca and plant medicines. And are you initially from America?
I am. I'm American. My story's a little strange. I was actually born in Sri Lanka, but to American parents. They were that was back during the hippie days, so they were traveling around. And yeah, I happen to be born in Sri Lanka, but I'm American. I grew up most of my life in the U.S., but also I kind of live in an interesting life where I traveled quite a bit in my youth and to a lot of other countries. So I think that was also probably part of the story was ever since a young child, especially with my father, I was going to a lot of, at that time, seemingly exotic places. This is before the internet and you can just Google an Airbnb. But there was something about a lot of those countries that I went to that I found very fascinating. And I think part of that journey also was really understanding and seeing that people were people wherever I went, and they had the same wants and desires and laughed at the same jokes. But there was something, it's always difficult finding a word, but in some of these more traditional and indigenous societies where I could sense that they were connected to something different than I was growing up in the US. And I think it was also something in my youth where I was really interested in, for example, I was a Boy Scout, I became an Eagle Scout, and a big part of that was being really fascinated by the North Native American traditions and just this act of prayer and reverence for nature and a connection to spirit. And they were all things that somehow really resonated with me, but I didn't really have the maybe cultural context or a specific path laid out of how do you do that. I became very interested in shamanism. I think as a kid, probably my two biggest interests were martial arts. I loved Jean-Claude Van Damme and Steven Seagal, and also shamanism. But, actually both of those paths at that time were a little obscure. In 2022 now, there's, I think, more clear-cut paths of how you can follow those. But So part of that journey was becoming just really fascinated. It was a deep inquiry into my own self, my own questions I had about myself, my place in the universe. And so that really led to all sorts of interests in religion and spirituality, exploring yoga and Tai Chi and martial arts, and traveling around the world, learning about different religions, spending inordinate amounts of time in the used bookstores because I didn't have any money, so just devouring these books. And then at a certain point, I became very interested in plants as medicine. I think part of that was beginning to learn about nutrition and why I and all of us are putting certain foods into our body, and that kind of led into herbalism, beginning to study traditional Chinese medicine, Ayurveda, and it was wonderful. But I think a lot of that was still, in a way, looking at things from a rather Western or allopathic worldview of, if there's a sickness, there's a specific plant that can treat that. And I was also sensing that there was something deeper. There was more of a holistic methodology of not only sickness, but health and who we are and what it means to be at peace. So eventually I became aware of these stronger plant medicines, and that also began to kind of tie that bridge to shamanism together. But I still didn't really know what to do. Like, shamanism seemed like a very far off thing. It was in Siberia, or maybe it was dead now and it was only in the past, or these druidic traditions. But like, how would I find it? And eventually, one of my best friends was working with ayahuasca, and he was part of the Santo Daime Church, which is a really big Brazilian church, which blends different traditions, but their main sacrament is ayahuasca. So I had known about it for a long time, but I think because of the religious aspect of it, I didn't inherently feel called to be a part of the Santo Daime community. But I think just being familiar with ayahuasca, it began to plant that seed. And then I think there was still something in me that was resisting like taking something from the outside to try and heal something from the inside. I think I was still under this worldview or cosmovision that everything I needed was inside, and I didn't need to take anything from the outside. But at a certain point, the calling, and if people have worked with ayahuasca, some people may understand this, but just there was this calling, and it kept getting stronger and stronger. And at a certain point, I couldn't ignore it. So I started looking, and at that time, I realized I wanted to go to the Amazon, where there was people who had been working with these plants for a long time, and I found myself at the Amazon in a big plant medicine center, the Temple of the Way of Light, and I had a profound experience. It kind of fulfilled my intention in a way, which was to connect to this world of spirit, to be in awe, to see beyond myself. And it was fascinating. And as I was mentioning kind of before we started recording, at that time I was living in New York, and I knew I needed to get out. And it was just kind of this serendipitous thing where I was offered a position there, and I went back, but just really out of this deep curiosity to learn more, like, how are these people doing what they're doing? What is this plant medicine? And that was I don't know, 10 or more years ago now, and I found myself really going deeply into that work, working a lot with ayahuasca, facilitating for many years, doing a process called dieting, or a dieta, which is kind of a traditional Amazonian process of learning from the plants. And then I began working with some other plants, specifically tobacco was something I was really called to. And so that's kind of where I find myself now. I'm living here in Peru, still working with a lot of these plants. And yeah, that's maybe a long story to answer that question.
Mm. That's great. Yeah. I do recall being invited to Santo Daime circles in like 2011, 2010. It just didn't, maybe even early, like 2009, maybe at the earliest. For whatever reason, that kind of Christian flavor just didn't really do it for me. Actually, it was kind of a turnoff. So I actually decided to wait until the right scenario popped up for me. And that's kind of an interesting crossover. So yeah, I really appreciate how you just kind of were exploring for so many years and then just jumped in and found the thing that worked for you.
Yeah.
you didn't mention any kind of fear. You noted straight, this was the connection I was looking for, which is kind of an interesting thing too. I've not necessarily heard it spoken of that way by many folks, but it's probably because you've been so deep in it for a decade. Yeah. And
did you say I didn't mention any sort of fear around it? Yeah. Well,
right. It was, you immediately mentioned like connection.
Yeah. Well, there's certainly, I mean, that maybe not having fear was part of my naivete to the whole experience, but I think that was part of the calling too. I mean, I knew I was going to be jumping into something very, very unknown. And so certainly there was fear around that, but I also, I think in a way did my best to really prepare for that. And there was a deep calling. And I think in many of these shamanic traditions, they also point to this idea of suffering. I mean, even if you look at Buddhism in that way, that there's this idea that suffering is inherent, that we all have that, even for some of us, if we're not able to put our finger on it. For some, it may be very on a more superficial level. For some, it may be on a more subtle level. But I think I had tried a lot of different things too, and I realized there was still something missing. And I just had this deeper sense that this was going to maybe not resolve everything, but it was going to give me some sort of insight that I needed to see. So it was almost coming from this may sound strange, but it was almost coming from a place of a higher calling of like, I had to do this. And so then once I made that decision, just doing everything I could, preparing myself, following all the recommendations to a T, and in a way, I think I was really rewarded for that. I think the fear came much later as I started to go deeper into these plants and also realize their true power. And one of the things that I often see, especially when I'm working with people, there's often two qualities that I see when people express these qualities. At least in me, there's a sense that they've gone really deeply into this medicine, and that's gratitude and humility. And I think that gratitude comes from actually realizing like the preciousness of life, the gift that we have. And the humility comes partly from that fear, from realizing that I'm not in absolute control, that there are things beyond what I think are real and unreal, and what I know and what I don't know. And when we're really hit with that, fear is a very natural response. And if we can overcome that, I think we're also left with a deep sense of humility, a deep sense of just of an awe of what these plants are able to show and to give us.
Yeah, I was just doing this is tangential, but I think I'm going to be able to tie it in. I was just doing some scuba diving, and I am not good at it at all. So I'm just like, overwhelmed. Like you can really get hurt and or die. And you get humbled by how wild nature is and how wild reality can be. And these really mind-bending dynamics of, flocks of fish, or I don't even know what the right term is for fish, but just like large crowds of them doing that cool thing that birds do, fly in synchronous orbit, or, in a little bit of synchrony. And, it kind of makes you feel small. And I think that is probably part of that. Yeah. Like the fear might be like, oh no, am I actually this small? And the answer is kind of yes. And, nature's pretty big. Reality's pretty big. And there's things out there that are so large that we can't really get with our mammalian sense organs. But when we start spending time inside through different methodologies, like we can get a relationship to those things over time. And it's really hard to communicate. Like I talk to a lot of physicians and scientists, and, it's not really in their frame. Right. That's all kind of abstraction or made up or whatever. But like the experience kind of shows us how real it is. Yeah. Anything come up for you?
Well, I think that's you often hear it like in a more Christian setting, which is that fear of God. And I think a lot of that has been misconstrued as to something like dark or evil, or we have to subordinate. But I think in its essence, it's also pointing to that sense of awe, that fear. On the other side of fear is also that humility, that respect. So a respect for God, a respect for the magnificence of creation, that creative force, that creative power, that if we do have a glimpse of that, we are left in just an utter state of humility, of awe. In the Bhagavad Gita, they talk about that. That's when Krishna is presenting himself to Arjuna, and they're very friendly because Krishna is presenting himself in a form that Arjuna is ready to see. And then he kind of gets arrogant anyways. Well, let me see you in all your forms. I'm ready for it. And he's like, "Are you sure?" And he's like, "Yeah, yeah." And he shows him his forms of. I think it's a very ancient and esoteric number, but his 10,000-fold face. And it's so overwhelming, the awe, the beauty, the terror, the horror, the infinity of it all, that he prostrates himself and he begs him to stop. And so, yeah, it's and we all have those fears. It's I've facilitated Navy SEALs and special forces and just really anyone who thinks like I've got this, I've got it, and these plant medicines can humble us all, and we're also not all ready for that too. Like we don't, I think it's always really important when we're talking about these experiences to also realize that they're extremely personal, that there's certainly archetypal experiences that these plants can invoke, but they're very personal as well. And for some people, what they need is the opposite of that. They need to see, beauty and love and their own self-worth and to have a very gentle experience. And then other people need to be thrown into the abyss to kind of shake themselves out of something. So, and I think that's where that idea of plant intelligence comes in, which is also, I think, something you were alluding to a bit when you're describing this to maybe an allopathic doctor or something. That's a very foreign concept. I mean, it was a foreign concept to me before I started doing this work. I mean, I would have been very skeptical if someone said something like that. But I think a lot of the problem, or not the problem necessarily, but we all come from a worldview. We all come from a cosmovision. And I think a lot of times when we hear that word, we like to think of it as like maybe only primitive people have a cosmovision, or only people in some jungle have a cosmovision. But we all have a cosmovision. Right. We all have a way of seeing the world based on our parents, our societies, our experiences, what we read. And to be shaken out of that cosmovision is that also ties back to fears. It's very scary because that cosmovision seemingly gives us some sort of solidity in this reality. It gives us a direction. It gives us a sense of what's right, what's wrong, what's up and what's down. And one of the things that I think plant medicine can do is it can very much begin to shake the foundations of our cosmovision, where we really begin to question what is real. Who am I? Like, is there an up and is there a down? Is there even something solid to stand on anymore? And that's always going to be scary in a way. That's going to shake the foundation of our house, of who we are, of our worldview. And I think that's also where this idea of wisdom comes in. And I've done a lot of work with the Shipibo people. They're a group of people in the Amazon, and they use the word ayahuasca, but that's not their word. Ayahuasca is a Quechua word, but their word for ayahuasca is uni. And uni, if you were to translate it, it often has this sense of wisdom or knowledge. And so that's what that medicine is pointing towards, this wisdom. And wisdom, I think, comes when we do begin to shake the foundations of our house, when we're able to see things in a different light. I think that's the Buddhist idea of wisdom, is, to see things from another point of view, to put yourself in another person's shoes. And that's always going to be difficult, because that, in a sense, I think another archetype that some of these plants can point to is this idea of ego death. And that shedding away of our ego is always going to be extremely, extremely difficult, because that's who we think we are. And to let that go, we're beginning to step into the abyss. We're beginning to step into the unknown. And no matter who you are, unless you're Jesus or the Buddha, that's you're beginning to embark on the hero's journey, and that's why also like all of these cultures all over the world have these tales, because they're trying to point to something, that journey is vital to gnosis, to knowing yourself, and these aren't just kind of other places point of views. I mean, even the foundation of our own system of Greek philosophy, and the oracle at Delphi is, when you look up, it's know thyself, gnosis. So I think these are universal principles, and they're, I just think in some of the cultures we've come from various reasons, those things have been lost, but they're universal. They don't inherently belong to one culture or another. They're and this may be a bit controversial, but I think they're pointing towards fundamental truths, or the truth, and that's why you see them in all of these cultures, these disparate cultures, which seemingly have very little related to them, and yet they fundamentally they have very similar worldviews, pointing to something that they've discovered through these various means of gnosis, of knowledge.
Mm. Yeah, you're pulling me back to a lot of my origin story. And I'm like, how do I proceed here? So yeah, this idea of a Gnostic experience is really interesting. And yeah, it's a worldwide phenomenon. Tale as old as time, probably. And yeah, you can have faith, but until you have that experience and knowing, what is it? Like and then there's this really interesting conundrum that I'm always fascinated by around, yes, you had this really powerful Gnostic experience that made you want to become kind of a missionary or something. And what do you do with that? Because is that really what's happening? Is there some interesting psychic dynamics going on there? Like, do you maybe need to go talk to a therapist for a few months before you decide to go tell everybody the good news, And it's like there's certain personal Gnostic experiences, right? And then there's kind of more universal, but how does an individual really differentiate? And that's an interesting conundrum I've seen come up a lot, both in kind of occult circles and in psychedelic circles. It's a really complicated deal. Have you had any insight into that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I don't know that there's an easy answer. I think, like anything, often I think for some of these things, it's easier to use an analogy that maybe more people are familiar with. I often use the analogy of martial arts, of jujitsu, just because I practice that. But it's a similar thing in jujitsu. If you look at most of the jujitsu evangelists, they're like white belts or blue belts. Those are the first two belts in the system, because they've seen the light. They've they've had this amazing experience. They think it's the end all be all, that it can do anything. If you know jujitsu, if you practice for 5 months, you can beat anyone. But then the reality starts to set in, and you realize, like, there's a whole world that I still don't know. There's a whole, there's people who operate on other levels that I still haven't necessarily competed with. And even once you reach the highest level, black belt, I mean, that's still just opening you up to a whole nother world. There's black belts, and then there's black belts. There's people who just got their black belt, and there's people who've maybe had their black belt for 20 years, or, guys who practice 5 times a day, every day, their whole life. It's a different thing. Mm-hmm. And usually when, as you kind of progress through that belt structure also, you tend to become less evangelical. And I think part of that is also because of the humility. People also realize, like, is jujitsu for everyone? Yes, like jujitsu is for everyone. Anyone can practice jujitsu. Anyone can gain a tremendous amount out of it. Is everyone for jujitsu? No, no. Just a lot of people aren't going to resonate with it. It's not gonna be good for them. Mm-hmm. And so I think all of these things are similar with plant work. I think in a way, what maybe differentiates plant work a little bit is that it seems to be in so many of these ancient cultures, these traditional cultures, they had these practices, whether it was through plants or some other form, meditative experiences, isolation, fasting. that gave them, as you said, some sort of form of gnosis, because at the end of the day, we are human beings, and what does that mean to be a human being? I think some of us, we ponder these questions, but it's very easy to get in kind of shamanic terms when you're under the effect of the medicine. They in Spanish they call it mareado. You're in the mareación, which means dizziness. You're under the effect, and interestingly, we often look at that as we say, well, I take this plant and now I'm mareado, now I'm dizzy, now I'm under the effect of the plant. But in a more shamanic worldview, they would say, well, this life is mareación. This life is dizziness. We're lost in the dizziness of life. We're lost in the maya. We're lost in the illusion. And to know oneself, gnosis is like vipassana. It's to see things how they actually are. In Christian terms, it's the apocalypse. It's to lift the veil and see the world as it actually is. So it's very easy to get lost in the mareación of life, in the dizziness of life. And one of the fascinating things, I think, is that, again, so many of these cultures had these techniques. And I think as more research is done, as more understanding is done, we'll actually see the plants were at the base of many, if not most, of those systems, because they give us very direct access to that, and it's taking us to these fundamental questions that we have. Who am I? Why am I alive? What is the purpose of all of this? And I think sometimes we think maybe those are silly questions, that because we can go down some bad rabbit holes with those, and sometimes that can seemingly make us more depressed or pessimistic. But ultimately, I think when we truly sit with those, when we go into them, those questions are also trying to bring us to our happiness, to truly be able to live this human life, which is a gift. And when we're lost in the mareación of life, we begin to forget that. We begin to get lost in that duality. I have to do this, I should do this, I shouldn't do this, why did I do that? And that mental story begins to take over our life. And it seems like even some of this psychedelic research seems to be showing that. It's like a lighting up of the brain, opening us up to all of these possibilities, and yet at the same time slowing down the brain, which I think for a lot of people is kind of antithetical to what they would have thought. They would have thought, like, well, it's going to make the brain fire and 10 times more, 100 times more, 1,000,000 times more. No, it actually seems to be slowing the brain down, like bringing it back to its origin, to that that abyss, that point zero, where in a way, like, that's where vipassana comes, when we're actually able to see the world how it is. And that's also a big question with plant medicine is like, well, why are we ultimately taking these things? As you said, like, is it to evangelize? Is it to have some experience, but then we don't integrate it into our lives? And some of the guides or the shamans who I have the most respect for, they tend to say a similar thing, which is, simply so that you can be happy, to really live this life from this place of joy, of happiness, of gratitude. And I think sometimes for some people that seems like a really base, a really kind of base explanation. I think it is. Now, I think what a lot of people, when they hear that, they feel like there's something missing. But I think, again, before we started recording, I was telling you about this guy Yamika and the two Wu people, and they had this legend where humanity was really suffering, and this was thousands of years ago, eons ago. I mean, this is like an origin myth story, and even at that time, humanity was suffering. And these higher beings, interestingly, they say from the star system Sirius, heeded this call, and they transcended the 12 dimensions of time and space on this primordial anaconda canoe. And they brought with them these plant medicines in order to aid these people to remember who they are, where they came from, so that they could also return home. And So I think to answer your question, because it's something I've also thought a lot about, is, can it be that simple as to be happy? Because also I'm fascinated by these traditions and Egypt, and just these unbelievably complex structures and cosmovisions here in Peru. But this ability to, in a way, transcend these 12 dimensions of time and space. But even that is to come home. To what does it mean to come home? And I think in that sense, that's also what they are pointing toward. To come home is to find peace, to find true joy. And if we are in that state, then there's nothing that's lacking. That's what even in this plant medicine work, when we're talking about, like you mentioned, kind of this idea, or alluded to this idea of integration. Like, how do we integrate this? We have this Gnostic experience. How do we integrate it? Well, that's what also integration means, to be whole. It means, it's the same word as integrity. It's the same word as to heal. To heal means to be whole. And I think if we're truly at peace, if we're truly happy, then there's nothing that's lacking. We are healed. We are whole. We are at home. But I think that journey very likely entails all of the infinite possibilities that come with that. And ultimately that journey back home, that remembering truly who we are, remembering that we're not separate, remembering that we are part of this whole. And the way that journey can manifest is as unique as each and every one of us.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot here. How do you so you have a lot of Westerners coming down, New World people coming down, and having sessions in, at the temple with you in the Sacred Valley or elsewhere. And how do you negotiate this kind of like New World cosmovision when people are now interacting with like Old World cosmovision, if we want to put it that way, indigenous cosmovisions?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's still something I'm trying to learn to navigate. For example, at the Temple of the Way of Light, they have a role which is called the facilitator, and that's someone who facilitates. I mean, I think even etymologically that word means to make easy. So it's kind of this idea of a bridge keeper, someone who's hopefully done the work themselves, who has a relationship with some of these people. In that case, the Shipibo people, has worked deeply in that system, has to some degree begun to understand their cosmovision, where they're coming from, how they're doing that work, what they're seeing, what they're doing, how they're working. But then also comes from, as you said, this more Western culture where we have a particular cosmovision, and how do we bridge those two worlds? It can be a really common experience. It's something we often joke about, but it's if it happens to someone, it can have a real impact. And like a Shipibo person might say, if you're talking to them, they may say like, "Hey, you have a demon inside of you," and if someone was to hear that from their cosmovision, that may be like, "Oh my God, like I'm possessed. My life is over. What the hell am I going to do?" But what does that mean? Again, even the etymology of that word means many different things. What relationship do we have with that word? How do we use that word? And so even things like that, language can become very very powerful. It can have the ability to heal. It can have the ability to not heal. So I think that role is important, like someone who can bridge keep. And also, before we were talking, I was telling you about that story of the Tubu from Amika, that we were coming to a time of, as he calls it, the Diro Amasa, the children of the new dawn, the people who can bridge the medicine from the four directions to create a new earth. And a lot of seemingly these traditional cultures have a similar tale, or I can't think of the word, like a premonition, and
Mythos.
yeah,
Okay.
like a mythos to to be able to relay this idea that we are entering this time of being bridge keepers, of taking all of this medicine, like really recognizing that every culture, every direction, every place has its medicine. And how do we bridge that? I mean, even using martial arts as an example, I think again it really correlates well. 30 years ago, when I kind of first started with martial arts, it was you had to practice taekwondo or judo or aikido or wrestling or boxing, and they all had their own cosmovision. They all had their strengths, but what was revealed is they also all had their weaknesses because they had become so ingrained in their rites, their rituals, their worldviews, that they overlook things, and then from that emerged this practice of mixed martial arts, where you took the best, realizing that all of these traditions had good things to offer, and taking that and creating something new. So, I think it's very similar in that way, and the danger sometimes of that I've seen is sometimes Western people can come and kind of idealize these traditions or these shamans, not realizing that they're also human, that they're also going through the human experience. There's people who do good actions. There's people who don't do good actions. It can also sometimes maybe like strengthen the ego of some of these practitioners. Like, I have this knowledge, I have this power, I have this domination, I'm better than. But then the opposite is true too. And so, I think when this work is done really well, obviously the patients who come, I think in an objective measure, are receiving more than they're giving. I mean, they're giving in other ways. Maybe they're giving financially, or they're working somehow, but they're receiving something very profound. But again, also the guides, the shamans who I've worked with, who I have a lot of respect for, they also say that they're learning. Like, they're also learning from the Western people who come down. Those people are helping to teach them how to do their work better, how to see things differently, how to integrate new practices into their work. So I think ultimately it's just doing one's best to be able to bridge those two cosmovisions. And those cosmovisions are different. And yet, kind of like I was saying earlier, when I was traveling as a kid, like, what I realized is that people were people too. Like, people eat, they drink, they shit, they want to have a family, they want to be at peace, they want to get along in their community, and so it's the same thing. And so I think a big part of that is being able to bridge like all that we share in common, and from that place of wisdom, like allowing all of us to be able to see things from a different angle, from a different worldview. Because often I find these things, that's why I often use like archetypes, or referring to Buddhism or Christianity, because it's an archetype or a worldview that we can understand. And if we can relay that, and if we can understand that in that worldview, and then we can see the parallel in the other, then I think it's much easier for us to begin to understand that, and to harmonize those things.
Yeah, that's great. So, yeah, this idea of merging systems is really great. And the knowing that there are some traditions out there that are actively trying to do this is lovely. Yeah, we were chatting the other day about how, Westerners will often kind of shun Western medicine, but a lot of folks in shamanic cultures, including, I don't really know how to say it, high level shamans maybe is a great way to say it. They'll actively be okay with modern Western medicine because they know their pharmacopoeia, and maybe they don't necessarily like some of the treatments for some of the disorders, right?
Absolutely.
Have you bumped into things like that before?
Yeah, that's something I saw a lot living in the Amazon jungle. Is a lot of the people who came down, they had this kind of anti-Western medicine view, and I think that's also where a lot of humility comes from. I mean, as I began to do this work, I also gained a lot of humility. Like, I have respect for anyone who's a doctor. It's a hell of a job. Someone comes to you and they're like, "I'm sick," and it's like, okay, well, now it's on me. And if they don't get better, that's also on me. And if they get worse, that's on me. Like, where do I start from? What do I do? I've learned all these things. It's there maybe in the intellect, but it's a much different thing when you actually begin to practice and have that responsibility. So I think Western doctors are amazing. And I think the vast majority of them come to it from a very good place of wanting to help and to heal. And Western medicine is amazing. It's, for example, in the Amazon jungle, if someone gets malaria, you would be very wise to take the Western pharmacological treatment for that. If you don't, you may die. And that's reality. And people have. Some people will be, well, I got malaria, I'm going to drink ginger, I'm going to, take honey. And, and it's like, those are great remedies. But if your life is on the line, what is important? And that treatment works. Does it have side effects? Of course. But are the side effects worse than dying? Absolutely not. Now, that's also not to say that there aren't indigenous Amazonian remedies. There are. But I think part of that also goes to in a way, the worldview of those different medicines. Like, knock on wood, I haven't gotten malaria. I've been very fortunate in that way. But part of that was also working very deeply with plants that cleanse the blood, that fortify the system because we can't, malaria is actually a fascinating thing because malaria comes from the word mal aire, bad air. So when we think about that, we think, well, that's just kind of a primitive point of view, but actually we're really not saying something very different. It's this kind of mosquito that's buzzing around in air. And then if it gets you, that bad air will infect you. But, often with plant medicine, I think something that any good doctor will admit is, often they'll say this in Spanish, but it would be translated as something like, these plants don't cure over a day and a night. Like, it takes work. It's a slower process, but it's getting to the root of it. It's working in this holistic way. But it's not just going to go away. It's not like I take a pill and then I'm good. It requires work. It requires time. It requires a commitment. It requires dedication. But it's going to begin to bring you into wholeness, into wellness, into healing. So, for example, with malaria, there are some very strong plants that you can take, which will very likely keep you from getting malaria. But how many people want to do that? How many people want to drink a really strong plant remedy? Maybe you're going to purge, you're going to have a not so pleasant experience. You may have to do that for weeks or months on end. But then maybe you have 10 years of you're good. You're kind of fortified against that. That's a legitimate system. And there's going to be people who are drawn to that and that's legitimate. And there's going to be people who there's no way in hell they're going to be able to do that. They may not have the time or the energy or the resources to do that. So if I get malaria, then I take the Western medicine. And one isn't inherently better or worse. It's a different way of working. And as you said, any good doctor, whether it's a Western doctor or a shamanic doctor, if there's something else outside of their system that works, they would be wise to use that. And if they don't, it's coming from their own prejudice. It's coming from their own cosmovision that isn't willing to look at something that doesn't work because it's outside of their cosmovision. And so it's, as you said, there's definitely, even in the jungle, there's many conditions where people will turn to pharmaceuticals because they just see it as a better option for whatever that remedy is. And I think, again, the other important thing to remember is that at the root, it's more us that like to compartmentalize. Like, this is a Western doctor, this is an indigenous doctor, this world is. But at the end, to be a doctor means someone who can try and heal someone. And if you're a good doctor, you do whatever you can to do that. I mean, that's the Hippocratic Oath is, do no harm, help the person, do whatever you can do. And whether that's using a plant or a pharmaceutical, I mean, even most pharmaceuticals, they are plant derived, which a lot of people don't realize as well. So, it's, there's many ways that we can do this work, but ultimately what any of us hopefully are doing is trying to help someone, and whatever tools we can have that allow us to do that, hopefully we're open to using those.
Mm. Are there any things, so you're a little removed being in Peru from this kind of wild psychedelic resurgence happening in the States and in the West, more developed nations. And, I'm kind of curious, like what you've observed from people coming down and what's happening in the larger scene. Do you have any like general commentaries or like things you would like to see people maybe look at more? It's a polite way of saying critiques. I guess.
Well, it's true. I do feel a bit removed from that. We were talking a little bit about that before we started recording. I mean, something that I always found fascinating and really drew me to a lot of these practices was that more holistic way of working, looking at different angles and trying to figure out from maybe a broader perspective. Even if we were thinking about it in more Western medicine, like I've always been more interested in that like general practitioner than in someone who's maybe really specialized in one thing. So I also think that these traditions have a tremendous amount to offer, and I think about anything. In general, I don't think people did things randomly. Like all of these traditions, they come from a place. They come from a time. They come from whether it's trial and error or gnosis, but wherever it's coming from, there's a reason they're doing things. Because again, we're all human. We want to heal. We want to do things well. And so when there's a practice around something, it's because it's serving something. And sometimes we don't, from maybe our more reductionist way of looking at things, it's easy to look at something, to not understand certain aspects, and then to just disregard them and say, well, they don't fit into my cosmovision or my understanding of the universe. Therefore, it's hocus pocus, or it's silly, or it doesn't serve any purpose. And then maybe 10 or 20 or 100 years later, we realize, oh, wait, there was something to that. I think it was an English doctor who that there was this was, I don't know, maybe early 1800s or something, but there was a fairly high infant mortality rate, and he came up with this crazy idea that doctors should wash their hands before they deliver babies. And he was so ridiculed, he was so laughed at. The doctors were saying, I mean, what, there's these invisible things in your hands that we can't see that are going to attach to the baby and cause it to die. I mean, what a lunatic, what a quack. And he was so ridiculed that I think he ended up dying in a mental hospital. And a number of decades later, the microscope was invented, and oh my God, there's these invisible like things that we can't see with our naked eye that are causing these issues. So I think the maybe critique that I have is along those lines, that sometimes we think that we can reduce something to something very specific, take it out of the tradition, take it out of the context, apply it to something else, and think that we're going to get the same results. And I think it's important that we try, because the answer could be, yes, we do get the same results, in which case, great. That's like the analogy of mixed martial arts. Like if there's all this other stuff that's not working and the essence of something is working, great. Like by all means, why keep all of that stuff? But it seems to me, and again, I haven't worked as much in what may be called like psychedelic assisted therapy, or working more with these isolated substances, synthesized substances. But it seems to me that there are things that are missing. And just from my limited experience, if I was to see someone who went through a more traditional process, and all of that entailed the dieting, the fasting, the going inward, the isolation, the working with plants, the receiving of the songs, the working with the shaman, maybe being in a group setting, all of the things that can arise from that, going away from one's home, going through this really cathartic experience, purging, just the many things that can come up, and compare that to someone who maybe just works in a clinical setting with an isolated substance. from what I've seen, the former person, they can both have profound experiences, but from what I've seen, the former person tends to be able to integrate that experience better into their life, and the effects tend to be more solidified. And in the latter, there may not be that same ability to truly have that medicine and that experience settle in. Now, again, part of that may be my own bias, my own judgment, my own lack of working in the other field. But, again, I think this idea of bridging and trying, separating the chaff is very important. But I also think it's important that we don't just inherently overlook a lot of these things that these cultures have really guarded. And also when we're taking things out of a cultural context, I think to some degree we owe it to ourselves and to the people we're working with that we understand that. It's like if you read a book and you read it in the original language, it has a much more profound meaning. The words mean very specific things. They play off each other. There's a cultural context to them. There's a lot more information in that. Every time it gets translated, it begins to lose things. So things can be lost. And also this idea of really honoring, like, well, where did that book come from? Honoring the people that it came from, honoring the people who wrote it, honoring the sacrifice and the trial and error, the knowledge, the working to get it to that point to where it's been able to be shared. So yeah, I would say those are probably maybe my two critiques, but I'm certainly not against that. If anything, the opposite. I think the more we explore and find what works, it's great. And at the same time, really, really understanding and honoring where these things came from.
Do you have much experience working with people who went through clinical trials, either with psilocybin or MDMA, and then kind of wanted to go deeper, or just go further in whatever capacity and come to the temple or come to you?
Yeah, to some degree. I mean, it's probably more of a recent phenomena because that wasn't something that was available maybe a decade or so ago. I would say more like a decade ago, it was more people who had maybe worked with these in other contexts, and then they came and worked in a more traditional context. And there was very often this sense of, oh my God, like, wow, this is different. This is deeper. There's something else that's being worked on. Having said that, again, much like the pharmacological example we used, I think there are situations where even working with someone in a clinical setting may be superior. That may be better for some people with what they're working for. Like we were talking about earlier, there's so many layers that we can use these plants to work on. And for certain layers, working in that setting may be even superior to like a more quote unquote traditional experience. I think that's very valid. I think, again, often when people refer to this work like ayahuasca or tobacco, iboga, there's often this word that they use, which is plant spirit. And as you were saying in the beginning, like if you're talking to a Western doctor, it just sometimes it's very difficult to bridge that gap. But I don't think that's random why they're using that word. Again, even from more of our own cultural context, like to breathe, like respirar, to be filled with spirit. That's what it means to be alive. To expire is to have our spirit leave us. So we have these words, these ideas, even built into our own cosmovisions. And so I think that's why I was saying also fundamentally, I think at the root of this work, like these ideas of fear, of questioning who we are, where we come from, I think that is at the root of this work. Now, there's all sorts of layers that prevent us from going into that, whether it's trauma or belief systems we have, anger, fears, jealousies, physical sickness, being mentally unwell, different disorders we have, different chronic conditions. So these plants are amazing in that way, that they can heal us on all of those levels, that they can work on our physical body. They can heal us of physical ailments. They can work on our mental, emotional state. They can work on traumas. They can work on core beliefs. They can work on relationships that we have, resentments that we're holding. And they work on that level of spirit, which again is maybe a bit more hard to define or people to understand. But I think that's more of that essence of who we are, where we come from. And interestingly, in a more shamanic worldview, often it would be pointed towards, we often look at, I think, things in a more Western view, that like the physical is the most real. That's where our ailment is. Maybe to a lesser degree, there's something going on in the mind, and then we don't really even think on a spiritual level. From the shamanic worldview, it's more inverted, that actually it starts from the spiritual point of view. When there's a disconnect, when we're not whole, then our mind begins to become troubled. And when our mind becomes troubled, over time, we begin to manifest physical ailments. So, these plants have the ability to work on all of those levels. And depending on where we want to work, how we want to work, there's different ways that potentially can address that in a better way. And ultimately, that's where I think these plants really were able to, in a way, transcend space and time in a more like shamanic level, but in just a physical reality, they've maintained themselves through time, is because they've been seen as something very important. Even if you think about the Amazon, I mean, we used to have this kind of thought that the Amazon was just primitive people. There weren't many people there. They were running around with bows and arrows. And yet they had this like unbelievably complex medicine. And there's always this like, well, how did they get that? And as the Amazon is studied more, it seems to be showing that actually there were very large groups of people, even civilizations of people, who had contact with other great civilizations like Incas, and and even I think as we studied the world more, we see that there was a lot more exchange between places than maybe we gave credit for. But just alluding to this idea that these, it's not that far-fetched to think that these medicines were ancient, and that they were guarded even through apocalypses and catastrophic events and colonization. But they kept these things. But why did they keep them? They kept them because they were seen as not only important, but actually something that was inseparable from humanity, like this idea of uni, of knowledge, of gnosis, that they gave us access to that. And so they were truly a gift in that way. So that's kind of, I think, a long answer to your question, but just that idea that the amazing thing about them is that they can morph in so many ways. And that's where that idea of intelligence comes in, or spirit. So if we're using them to treat PTSD and that works, that's amazing. And I think that speaks to that intelligence of that plant, that it has the ability to do that. If it can cure you of your chronic Crohn's disease, amazing. Like that speaks to the power of the plant. If it can help you to remember who you are, where you came from, if it can help you to give you a glimpse of this God experience, amazing. That's also part of the gift of the plant. So I think all of these ways are important, and also they're not ultimately separate. But yes, I guess your initial question was like, when people come down, can there be a different experience? And from my experience, it is yes, but probably that different experience, it's having to relate more to that realm of spirit, and when people have a glimpse of that or touched by that, it also has a very profound effect on their mental, emotional well-being and their physical well-being. And that's where you also hear, you probably, I don't go on YouTube much, but I'm sure you can go on YouTube and hear these miraculous stories of someone came down and drank ayahuasca and their physical ailment went away. That's also reality. I'm not putting that out there that, someone should expect that, but that is reality. And that's all part of that system where it's working on all of those levels so that all of those things can be a reality.
So I want to affirm your idea of ancient commerce of ideas and medicines and traditions. Was hanging out with the world top expert on Mongols, the Mongolian empires and ancient Mongolia, and another person who's a classicist, professor of classics, and pretty serious contributor. And we were talking about the commerce around like Soma between India, China, and probably Greece. And there is like substantial evidence of the ancient Greeks having a lot of commerce. And I'm more familiar with the Greek world than, the ancient South American world. But, this is a phenomenon, and it's underplayed because there's a lack of evidence. But the story that's accepted and propagated gets updated as more evidence becomes included. I'm thankful for Graham Hancock for keep saying things just keep getting older and older. And there's probably cultures so old that we don't even know about them. And, if we want to get a little spooky, but, so just affirming that. And then I wanted to come back to this idea of group and group process, or go ahead. And then I'll jump to group.
Sorry. Yeah. I was just saying, even if you look at, kind of that bridge, India to Greece, you also pass through, Persia. And in ancient Persia, in the Zoroastrian religion, they had a substance called hauma. And in Farsi, you don't pronounce the S, you pronounce it like an H. So soma was homa. And it was also a sacrament that the Zoroastrians took to, again, have this godlike experience. So I think exactly as you're saying, that there's a lot of evidence. It's just kind of that idea of that general practitioner. It takes someone who can really look at things and kind of connect the dots, because I think we have become so specialized that for a long time it was hard to see the commonality, like to be the bridge keepers of these things. But through the internet, through a lot of different reasons, I think it is. I think my sense is in the coming years, we're actually going to have a radical view of history, a radical change and very much as you're pointing towards, that there was something much more ancient, there was something much more connected, and traces of that have kind of been left throughout the world for us to begin to put those pieces together.
Yeah. In particular, what is this? The Younger Dryas period with the asteroid strike, and
absolutely,
civilization rebooted in a really weird and interesting way, right around that point. And what the hell was that? And we need to think about it. This is one of the reasons I love this topic of psychedelics and plant medicines, is because it's kind of included in this weird, spooky revision of history, where perhaps we were, some of us, maybe not all of us, were a little happier for a while. And actually, that's an interesting reversion back to what you were saying before about happiness. Worth considering. But, I'd probably rather be alive today. Pretty fun. But who knows?
Yeah.
But I want to circle back to this idea of group process, because you're talking about that kind of, I hate to criticize it, but I'm going to say this word, colder clinical setting versus like a warmer kind of group, religious, in a sense, medical practice, maybe. So in my world, I'm deep in the holotropic breathwork world, and we call it dream shadow transpersonal breathwork, what we do. And, some people might not be ready for group work. And that's kind of, you were hinting at that a little bit. Like maybe they're too sick for group work, and it might not be for them. And it might, even if they're a little afraid of it, maybe it is actually the case that they're not really an appropriate match yet for group work. I was thinking regularly about, somebody, in my traditional view, like we can probably get away with a few plant medicine or psychedelic sessions that are pretty big. And then the rest of it could just probably be group breathwork practice or something. You don't necessarily need other things, but it's like you might need that thing to just get you over the hump, like heal you enough where you can be in relation and in these healing circles. And I don't know. Any thoughts on that? I have a follow-up question after that.
Kind of going back to this idea, like it seems like one of the ways that these medicines are being used is with this idea of PTSD. Often there's been a lot of studies with veterans who have that. And that's reality. In that environment, they go through some very difficult things. Also, one of the things that, for example, a lot of veterans recount when they get back is one of the things that's very difficult for them is they've lost that group container, that group container gave them comfort. It gave them camaraderie. It made them feel like they were serving a higher purpose. And then when they go back out into their life, that group becomes fragmented and they lose those bonds. And that's very difficult. So there's something about that group container, which, I mean, this may sound kind of funny or woo-woo, but I think it goes also to that universal spiritual principle of oneness, and that a lot of our suffering came from the primordial split into duality. And when we're in that group container, it's a very common experience where people feel unbelievably connected to one another. If they're struggling, that group energy or dynamic kind of picks them up, it holds them. When one person is down, they have shoulders to lean on. It's much easier to see that I'm not the only one suffering, that there's, 15, 20, 30 other people going through this process, and they also have very difficult stories. They're also going through trials and tribulations. They're also on this hero's journey, and it creates this environment where it very much helps people on their own journey. And it's kind of the paradox, because ultimately it is a self journey. When you ingest the substance, there's no one else there. It's you. It's you, and you. And but there can often be something very comforting about knowing that there's someone else there, which is where having a good guide or a shaman is there, even a good facilitator, even just knowing, sometimes in that abyss where it feels like everything is falling apart, where the struggle is so great, or that the pain seems so much, just knowing that there's another human being in that space. There's a beating heart. There's a warmth. There's other signs. Another sign of life can be extremely powerful. And so also kind of in this archetypal hero's journey, when you go in with a group, there's a real process that you go through together, and a lot of, in kind of the terminology of this work, a lot of projections can come up, a lot of judgment, idealizing, all sorts of things can come up, which actually can be seen, becomes directly related to one's process. And so the work doesn't just happen in the ceremonial space. It also begins to happen outside that ceremonial space, with the interactions we have, with what we see arising, with how I'm judging someone, or how I'm talking to someone, or am I being like overly motherly to someone, or am I completely disregarding someone? And all of a sudden, because we're also still in that medicine space, it may not be quite as strong once we're outside of ceremony. We still have medicines in us. Life then begins to become part of that medicine space, and all of the things that we're working on are now directly, we have to begin to put them into practice. And because we have medicines in us, there's a stronger quality to them. Maybe things that we did in the past, but we're doing them now, it has a much deeper impact on us. And so in that way, a lot of work ends up being done outside of just the quote unquote ceremonial space. So I think that's one really, really big advantage. It also really helps with this idea of integration, like this idea of the vets, for example, when they come back, they don't really have necessarily a community. They're all spread out. One of the things when you go through that experience together with a group of people is a lot of people would say, like, I'm closer to these people now than I am my own family. Like these are some of my best friends now. Like I've shared this heroic journey with someone that we've experienced life and death and shitting ourselves and puking on each other and screaming, and I feel extremely close to these people now, and they now become a part of my life. And even once we leave here, if we're struggling, like I now have these people who I can also rely on. So I think that is also a very healing aspect of that. It's also paradoxical in a way, because even traditionally, this work was often done in a ceremonial context for that very reason. It could be done amongst a tribe or a group of people to harmonize things. That there was often other aspects of that. There could be fighting beforehand to relieve aggression, to take out grudges. There could be ceremonial getting drunk and dancing and releasing that. And then at a certain point, ingesting these substances to bring that group together, to create a shared vision, to understand how we move forward, to re-remember who we are, to rebuild these bridges, these bonds amongst each other. And on the other hand, this work was also done in isolation. That was also one of the ways it was done, where you went off into the woods and you ingested this plant, usually under the guidance of a teacher or a guide, to really begin to work on yourself. So that as you worked on yourself and you came back into your community, you were a better member of that community. You had humility, you had compassion, you had an understanding. You could fulfill better whatever your role in that community was, whether it was the bridge keeper, the medicine person, or the leader, or the warrior, or the pacifier, whatever your role was, you were able to do it because you had done your own work now, and you had a better understanding of who you were, what your place in the world was, how to interact with people. So I think, as you're saying, there's different contexts in which these can be worked on. And sometimes, as you were alluding to, maybe someone has a lot of trauma. And that's why, for example, there's women's workshops. Maybe there's a group of women who have a lot of trauma around men, and they feel that being in that container is going to be more therapeutic for them. They'll be able to release more. They won't have maybe a sense of judgment or a sense of someone being predatory towards them, whatever that may be for them. They may find that better. Someone else, often these things could arise from trauma, but also maybe not. But maybe they don't feel comfortable in a group setting. They don't feel comfortable being around a lot of people. They feel more comfortable working with one or two people, or maybe only sitting with their friends or their family. So if you just throw someone in a group experience, that may not be the best for their healing. Ultimately, should they go in a group experience? Probably. At some point, if there is resistance to that, if there is some trauma around that, eventually, hopefully, we can work to a place where that trauma is resolved. But initially, that may not be the best thing for them. Working one-on-one may be more healthy for them. If we're trying to resolve maybe a specific ailment, going into that isolation process could be more beneficial for them. Being around people can also be distracting in a way. Our mind can begin to go in other places. And so having that time where there's nothing else to distract myself with, where it is just, me, that can be very beneficial. So I think, much like we were talking about earlier, all of these things, there's a time and a place for it. There's benefits to certain things. There's some drawbacks to certain ways of doing things. But ultimately, it's what is going to be best for the patient. And that's also something that's fundamental to any holistic medicine, is realizing that there's no panacea for everyone. Like, we're all different. We all have different body types. We have different stories. We have different physical ailments, different mental stories. So how do we find the medicine that's going to be best for us in this moment?
Beautiful. Yes. And that's key. It's this the new buzzword is in medicine is something around like specific or like customized or targeted medicine. So it's like, okay, we actually now understand you. We're not just following the diagram. Mm-hmm. So it's coming in modern medicine, which is going to be great. Yeah. But next question. So in holotropic breathwork and things like LSD, MDMA, not necessarily a plant spirit in the mix, right? And they all seem to do okay, right? Like they're not necessarily not been enough research for me to really speak to the efficacy of all the different options. I love holotropic breathwork. I love LSD. I love MDMA. I also love ayahuasca. And it's interesting, like the fact that there isn't that plant spirit there makes it a really different conversation, because you'll see a lot in the decriminalized movements. The people are talking regularly about the plant spirit and excluding maybe the human spirit that has agency to heal itself when tied with certain tools like LSD, MDMA, or breathwork, or all sorts of other methods, right? Like, do Do you have any thoughts on this kind of thing? Is it just the inherent nature of the human body that it can heal? Or what else is going on there? And like, what is it not magical that we alone without other spirits necessarily, as if MDMA and LSD don't have a spirit? Like there's a chance it does. They do. And there's a chance holotropic breathwork also does. I don't have enough experience to speak to that directly, but it's something magical about the human organism that can reach these interesting states. I don't know. Any reflections or thoughts on that?
Well, I think in many traditional or indigenous cultures that they do have this idea that everything has spirit. If something is alive, it has spirit. That's how else could something be alive? If everything is a manifestation of spirit, of source, of God, then everything is infused with that spirit. Again, spirit is such a it's a word that, again, we can think about it in so many different ways depending on our cosmovision, what we think that word means. Here where I am in the Andes of Peru, it's not as common that people work with plants in that way, plant spirit medicine. But they believe that the mountains have spirit. They call them apus. And so they'll go up to the mountains and they'll do offerings. They'll give thanks to the four directions. They'll spend periods of isolation in the mountains. And even when I came up, I was a little, I don't know. Does this apu really have a spirit? But at least from my perspective, being up on those mountains, there's something very spiritual there. There's a silence. At least for me, I feel much closer to death there. You may be 14,000, 15,000 feet up. The oxygen is very thin. The life literally starts to go away. There's almost no plants. There's almost no animals. And you get high enough and there are none. There's no plants. You don't even hear a bird. All you hear is maybe wind. And there's this silence there. And at least for me, there's this sense of like death is very near. A storm comes in. You fall, a rock slips out from under you. It's so cold that you start to feel that deep internal cold. That just even this sense of stillness of just it's devoid of life in the way that I think many of us think of life, which is like action or energy, like this kind of frenetic quality. Much like in the jungle, it's just life is everywhere. And we look at that and we see like very clearly, oh yeah, this is full of life. And I think when we go up into those mountains, it's seemingly devoid of life in that same way. And yet I think anyone, maybe not anyone, but many people, if they go up there, they would feel that sense of spirit. They would feel that there's something that they're beginning to tap into. And so, yes, I think all of these ways, especially any way that has a tradition behind it, or that has experience to it, like again, does something work? And if it works, then amazing. Again, that idea that a mountain has spirit, most of us wouldn't think about that, and yet certainly for the people around here, they would say that mountain has spirit. In terms of LSD, I mean, I think some people like surmise that LSD is related to like ergot, which, so it may be very similar to a plant substance. I think there was a case of, I think when maybe it was R. Gordon Wasson went to Mexico and he worked with Maria Sabina. He took mushrooms with Maria Sabina because she also said these have spirit. And he came back and he isolated psilocybin and he brought it back in a pill and he gave it to Maria Sabina. And apparently how I've heard the story is she took that and she said, this also has spirit. Like it also is able to do what I'm able to do. Maybe not exactly the same, but she said it had spirit. Certainly holotropic breath work, I think that's maybe a different thing because we're not ingesting something into us. It's something that we're working with breath. But again, as I mentioned earlier, to breathe, respirar, to be filled with spirit. So I think any breath work also inherently is working on this idea of spirit. I mean, again, I don't think it's even, in German, Atman. That's the word for, breath, the Vedic word, Atman. In India, you use it, Atman. So I think there's always been a very strong correlation in a lot of these traditions between breath work and spirit. That by focusing on the breath, whether it's something passive or active, that we're also beginning to potentially tap into those same possibilities that we are with plant spirit medicine, or going up to a mountain that we say has a spirit. So it's, again, that's where I think looking to tradition and honoring tradition is very important, because when you look at breath work, it's not something that was isolated. It's something that you see all over the world in all of these disparate cultures. There was something very fundamental to breath. On the most basic level, why? Because to breathe in, to respire, to inspire is to be filled with spirit. To expire is to die. It's so there's something fundamentally about the breath. It's, as we come into this world, the first thing we do is we're filled with spirit, and the last thing we do when we leave this world is, and the spirit. However we want to look at it, it moves on from the body, and the body, we say, is now deceased. It's expired. It's without spirit. That obviously leads to many more questions. What is spirit? Where does the spirit go? But even, in a very basic language, that's what we're pointing towards.
I love it. Yeah, and your use of mountain as an example is great. I like to go to a weird extreme with analogies to prove the points. And I remember some stories from Michael Harner, who was an early kind of anthropologist in the Amazon. And he saw some tribes talking about, we're doing all these rituals. We're going to do the spirit of the tree and the river and the motorboat, like things like that. It's, these Western inventions and machines that we think are lifeless and soulless. And perhaps there's something there if all comes from that, and, has some of that imbued in it. And, your discussion there around the mountain was kind of really helpful for me, because I spend a lot of time at high altitudes, and there is not much life at a lot of those altitudes, and if not zero, other than me. And it's quite the experience to be exposed. You could absolutely be hurt or killed at some of these altitudes, and but what is it that keeps drawing you back? There's this really interesting experience. There's possibly some energy, things going on, or just a lot of people, it's just a perspective thing. But I think it's more magical than that. But I don't like to talk about it. I let other people do that for me.
Well, funny, you use the example of a motorboat, because I know a number of shamans, of curanderos, who've dieted gasoline. And I think when you think about that at the beginning, you're like, well, that's very strange. But also when you think that
my
these
first reaction is, I hope they're okay.
But when you really think about it, these are like oil, petroleum, gasoline. These are like very ancient, reconstituted plant material that's been buried in the earth for long periods of time. And I think there's something, like, whether they realize that on an intellectual level or not, there's something in them that senses there's something there, that also has spirit. And so it's, it was the same when I first heard that. I was like, well, that's crazy. That's going to kill them. And yet it didn't. Obviously, everything is in the dose and how you work with it. But it is fascinating when I think sometimes these things that we wouldn't think of as having spirit, if we really think about them, that there is a way of maybe looking at that, even from our own worldview.
Right. With dietas, you're not necessarily eating a macro amount of things, right? Or being with a macro amount of things. It can be a really small amount, right?
There's different traditions have different ways of doing things, but as a general, I guess, rule, usually when you're dieting, you're in isolation. you're eating a very small quantity of food, because the idea is you actually want to begin to weaken your body. And because it's said when the body is weak, the spirit is high. And I think that's something we've often, probably some of us experience, if we've ever had a near-death experience, or even if we just get something like the flu. Sometimes when the body is very weak, there's a bit of perspective. There's almost like a higher awareness where we're looking at our lives in a different way. Because in a way we have to be, because our body is so weak. There's nothing else to really distract ourselves with. It's forcing us internally in that way. So eating a very small amount of food, very particular food, usually something very bland, no meat, or maybe a particular type of fish, something like plantain or yuca or rice, just something very bland, maybe fruit, depends on the tradition. And then ingesting this plant substance, which that can depend on the tradition. It could be macro in the sense that you're taking like a heroic dose. It could be a smaller dose where it's working more on the subtle level. As your body begins to weaken, you would need less medicine to take you there as well, because you do become more sensitive. But the idea is to create a space, a set and setting that allows that plant to really be able to deeply penetrate, so that you're able to learn from it.
Beauty. Yeah, I really try to draw analogies to Western things regularly, and it feels a little bit like the idea behind homeopathy, but it's obviously less abstracted from like the whole thing in terms of like an energetic abstraction, which is like really hard for us to think about. It's really hard for me to think about, but I understand intellectually what's going on there, and I do appreciate that. I've never done a real deal dieta. So like I did prep appropriately according to all the instructions I was given, but it was never like, eat this, pine needles or something after you finish your rice. It wasn't like that.
Yeah. Usually with the dieta, you're drinking quite strong medicine. So I think the analogy with homeopathy that's the analogy in the sense of maybe this more subtle level where the medicine is penetrating in. But the actual medicine yourself that you're drinking is not like diluted or anything in a way. It's very strong. You're usually drinking like the essence of the medicine, which can often give you a psychedelic experience. It can make you purge. It can make you shake. It can bring on very strong experiences. So that's where also like the dieta itself can be very difficult, because a lot of things are being brought to the surface on the physical level, on the mental, emotional level. I mean, for example, I remember the first time I dieted tobacco, the first 3 days, I thought for sure I was going to die. I mean, I was on the floor, I was sweating profusely, my heart was pounding, and I literally couldn't even yell out to the guy who was serving the medicine, like if I needed help, because there was no voice there. I was so like curled up in a ball, and I couldn't even reach for my puke bucket because to move my arm was too difficult. So, but a lot of these traditions vary wildly too. So some dietas can be more subtle. Some dietas can be very intense. It depends on the plant you're dieting. If you're not dieting a very strong plant, for example, in the Amazon, there's a number of plants that are very strong. So for example, tobacco or toei or chiricsanango, these plants are going to give you a very strong experience. But then there's other plants which are more subtle, which wouldn't necessarily give you a very strong experience, but then probably throughout the dieta, you would be mixing that plant with something which does give you a stronger experience, whether that's drinking ayahuasca or drinking tobacco, to allow you in that way you're describing to then connect on that more subtle level to what is actually happening. And a lot of that subtle level actually happens through the dream space. And in a lot of these shamanic practices, that's where it's said that the teaching comes from, is through that dream space. So as our body is very weak, as we're ingesting these substances, because there's nothing else to do, because we're alone, not only does the dream space at night begin to open up, but also during the day, it almost becomes like a waking dream too. And so we begin to become more alive to or sensitive to all of these different things that are happening. And the dreams also take on a much different quality. It's a very common thing where people come and they do a dieta, and the dream space opens. And even if they remember their dreams in kind of normal waking life, a really common thing they say is these dreams are much different. They have a much different quality. It takes on much more of an archetypal quality. It's a language that the plants show us, and they're teaching us in a certain way. But it's also very fascinating because, like, as you were saying, using Western analogy, the plants begin to teach us, and they have to teach us, I think, in a way, in our own language, not just a literal language like English, but through our past, our life experiences, the images that resonate with us. When we think of spirit, what is that? How does that come to us? Is it Jesus? Is it a ball of light? Is it Krishna? Is it Muhammad? And it's going to be very different for every person how that medicine begins to speak with them. It's going to speak in a language that they understand, that resonates with them, but it's also speaking in a way that's mysterious, that one has to begin to, in a way, decipher what that teaching is pointing them towards.
Yeah. Trying to figure out a way to wrap this up here, Jason. I'm kind of, thinking we did a real tour de force here, and it's good because we underrepresent shamanic traditions here. So I'm really thankful for you coming on and kind of laying a lot of this out for us. So I don't know, any kind of theme you picked up on, or anything you kind of want to leave us with, or leave the audience with?
Well,
before we talk about your links and everything.
Yeah. Also, it's a tale that I've really resonated with, and I mentioned it to you before we started recording. But I think the work you're doing is very important, and it's this tale that I mentioned earlier. These Tubu people from the Colombian Amazon, and that they have this legend, this prophecy that we're entering this place of a new dawn. And going back to ancient cultures, even not in a woo-woo way, but something that's fascinating too is that all of these ancient cultures have these prophecies, have these ideas, based on literal science, on precessional equinoxes of 25,000 years, broken into 12 different epochs, 12 different great years, and how we pass through these times and these cycles. And that, yes, the world can be disrupted by cataclysmic events of asteroids and comets that reset humanity. And yet, this knowledge is kind of, it was never completely wiped out. Some trace still, through the immense amounts of time and change, managed to stay. And I always found it fascinating in the Vedas. They say, it's this most ancient book. It's not a book, but it was verbal tales that were passed down and have now been recorded. But that they say, this knowledge came to us from the ancient ones. And I always thought, well, weren't you the ancient ones? There was even more ancient ones before you that passed you this knowledge. And but so this Tubu prophecy saying that we're entering this time of the Diro Amasa, the children of the new dawn, the people who are able to bridge the medicine of the four directions. And I think what you're doing and so many people in so many fields, but especially around this work of plant medicines and really beginning to remember, to reclaim this seemingly lost knowledge, which is at the root of all of our cultures. It's the root of Western culture. It's the root of every culture. And it's there's a reason why it was guarded and why it was kept through all of these epochs of change, and because it's about this idea of remembering who we are, so that we can truly be happy, truly live in harmony, see these things that all of these religions are pointing towards, not judging our enemies, coming from a place of love, creating a harmony, and it. Part of that medicine is also the word, and it's sharing stories bringing people together. And that's super important. And I think, like you said, sometimes there's people who disregard maybe some of these more Western practices, but they're also not Western at all. I mean, they're not exclusively Western at all. Like the guy who I mentioned, Amika, the Tuwu people, that's a huge part of their tradition, is sharing these stories, sitting around in groups, talking to each other so that this knowledge isn't lost, so that it's alive in all of us. And so I think what you're doing is great. And yeah, thank you for having me. And it's, I think it's, it's up to all of us in a way to create this new earth and to create the life we want, which that's a whole nother maybe podcast about, some of these spiritual principles, but it's I think it's great. So I commend you to that. And thank you for having me on.
Thanks, Jason. And can you let us know where folks can find you on the internet?
Yeah. So if people are interested in learning about the work I do or coming to work with me, I have a website called nicotianarustica.org. Nicotiana rustica is the Latin name for tobacco, the particular type of tobacco we work with here called mapacho. So nicotianarustica.org. And then I still work from time to time at the Temple of the Way of Light. So if anyone is interested in working with ayahuasca or going to a retreat, they can go to templeofthewayoflight.org. And then I also, towards the beginning of the pandemic, created a podcast called The Universe Within Podcast, where really the idea was much like you're doing, to give voice to a lot of people who I have respect for. Also giving voice to a lot of the practitioners of this work, the indigenous practitioners, the bridge keepers, the people who are bridging these traditions, and so allowing them to share and hearing it directly in their voice. So that's called The Universe Within Podcast, and you can find it on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, all of the big places.
Beautiful. Well, Jason, this has been a lovely experience. I really appreciate you coming on, and I do hope we can do it again. Have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
And there you have it, everybody. Jason Grechanik of the Universe Within podcast, a long history at Temple of the Way of Light and many more places. So really, really lovely conversation with Jason. Appreciate you, Jason, for being out there and joining us on the show. Yeah, I hope you all learned something. At the very least, learning people's worldviews is important, folks. So hold on to that. And yeah, I think that's good for now. So thank you all for tuning in to Psychedelics today. This is Joe Moore signing off. And yeah, we'll see you on the next episode. Take care, everybody.